So thank you very much for that. And welcome to Grimsby. You know, I'm, as the regional ambassador for the Labour campaign for drug policy reform, I'm very, very proud to be hosting this event in North East Lincolnshire, in the place that I've been lucky to be working and to have called my home for the last 2 years. And we've not only got people from North East Lincolnshire, we've got people from all over. As far as I'm aware, we've got people from Hull and Scunthorpe and even further afield. So we've got people from across the region, from Lincolnshire and Humberside, and it's great to see you. And we're all here today for the same reason that I wanted to get this event here, is because we care so much about this issue in our communities. And as a primary school teacher in the West Marsh, this is something I see almost every day. Whether it's the child who's been removed from her parent because her parent's drug use hasn't been supported and given the treatment that she needed to help her. Or that parent whose drug use is now more likely to lead to her death than at any time in our history, because drug-related deaths are at record levels. And shockingly, for children as young as 11 years old, who are being brought into criminal drug gangs across county lines. This is an issue that affects all our communities, and the current way we're doing things is not keeping our vulnerable people in society and our children safe. So we've waged the war on drugs, and by the war on drugs, we mean giving criminal penalties for possession of drugs for nearly half a century now, so it's about 1971. And these are the results. Drug deaths are at record levels. The drugs trade, the illegal drugs trade, is as profitable as ever. Drug gangs are as powerful as ever, and children as young as 11 years old are being brought into them through county lines. Now we could say that we need to double down on the war on drugs and arrest more people and do it harder. But we've been doing that approach for 50 years, and it's simply not working. Before the Misuse of Drugs Act was brought in 1971, before the war on drugs started, there were roughly 1,000 heroin users. Today there are over 100,000, if not more. And it's not even supported by the evidence as well. There was a paper released by the Home Office which showed that criminal sanctions for drug possession does not have any significant impact on drug use. Or we could try a different approach. Countries around the world, and some areas in the UK actually, I regret that Ron Hogg, the Police and Crime Commissioner for Durham, is not able to be here tonight because he has been leading the way on this issue. But countries around the world are seeing the drugs issue not as a criminal one, but as a health issue. Let me tell you the Portuguese story, for instance. Since 2001, Portugal has decriminalised possession of drugs, and they have had spectacular results. They've seen drug-related deaths go from one of the highest in Europe to now one of the lowest. They've seen drug-related crime fall dramatically. They've seen hepatitis B and C reduce for drug users. They've saved lives and they've reduced crime. Let me tell you the Swiss story. In Switzerland, they have been prescribing heroin to heroin users. And since they've been doing that, they've also seen a massive reduction in crime. They've been able to help those users get their lives back on track and get into work. They've saved lives, they've improved lives, and they've cut crime. But we don't have to go to other countries to try something to find out about a different approach. In the 80s, a man called Dr. Marks, he worked in the Wirral, he also prescribed heroin to heroin users. And in that area in the Wirral, he saw a dramatic decrease in crime, about 90% reduction in crime. He helped his users, support them in getting jobs and building their lives on track. And tragically, when he was shut down by the authorities, over 40 of his patients died 2 years later. Now the tide is turning against the war on drugs, and we're seeing other radical things in other countries as well, with the regulation and legalisation of marijuana. So the tide is turning across the world with some spectacular results. Will we learn from them, and will we follow them in doing something different as well? And that's the reason why we're here today. It doesn't matter what party you support, it doesn't matter, or if you support any. If you care about this issue, we want to hear you, have your say. We want to hear your opinions and your ideas, and we want to try and find a different approach. So I'm very, very excited to hear your ideas, and we can hear them in many different ways from your questions. We can hear them from Twitter. The Twitter hashtag is up there, hashtag Labour Drug Reform, so tweet in your questions and your comments throughout. If you don't get the chance to say all that you want to say, there will be forms being handed out at the end so that you can make your points at the end. So everybody's opinion will be heard if you want it to be heard tonight. And that's why we're here today. We're here to shape the UK drugs policy and change it for the better. So I'm very excited to introduce you to some of our fantastic speakers tonight. First of all, we have, who's chairing the event, so thank you very much for coming, Mel, is Melanie Onn MP for Great Grimsby. This is an issue that affects our community. We really appreciate you coming along today. We've got Neil Woods, who was a former undercover operative turned a leading advocate for drug policy reform. He's also a best-selling author. I've just recently finished his book, Good Cop, Bad War. It was fantastic. I recommend it to you. He's also written another book called Drug Wars. So he'll be doing a keynote address tonight. We have Mr. Tim Cottingham from Cottingham Pharmacies. He set up one of the first needle exchanges in Grimsby in the 1990s, and he has helped and supported over thousands of users in his time. And we have Keith Hunter, who is the Police and Crime Commissioner for the Humberside area. Again, thank you very much for coming to have your say, and we're looking forward to hearing your opinions tonight. Keith has done a very good job, as he was telling me, in keeping police numbers high, particularly in an age where funding has been reduced for them. So well done for that, Keith. And we have Suzanne Sharkey, who is part of the organisation that Neil's part of, Law Enforcement Action Partnership. And she was a former undercover agent, just like Neil, and for the Northumbria Constabulary, and now she is a leading advocate for drug reform. So we're very, very excited to hear your ideas and to hear the ideas of our speakers and panellists tonight. So let's give them a round of applause. So first of all, I'd like to pass it over to Melanie, who's going to talk about the issue in Grimsby.
And we have had for probably the last 30 years this idea that if we go to war against drugs that we will win. But 30 years later, and with the news this week that Scotland has got the highest rate of drug-related deaths in the whole of Europe, we plainly are losing that war. And so it's absolutely right that we think again about what it is that we're doing, that how we approach this, and consider whether or not it's working. And I don't know, perhaps people are just interested generally in policy development, but perhaps there are people here who've got some personal experience of drug use, either directly or within their families. Perhaps they have been victims of crime associated with drug use. Perhaps they have lived next door to people who are dealing drugs, because there are so many people who are affected by it. You do not have to be a drug user to be affected by the impact of drugs on the local community. And Johnny has quite rightly touched on a couple of those. In Grimsby, we are one of the main areas that is suffering, although increasingly it is spreading all around the country, of county lines drug running. And that impacts so many across our community. We have repeated drug raids across all areas of Grimsby, which causes huge devastation, disruption and upset for other people who are living in those areas. They are grateful when those drug raids can finally take place, when enough evidence has been collected so that those houses can be destroyed. However, the people who are normally in those houses, they're not the main culprits of the drug running. They just hop on somewhere else and they move their trade elsewhere. And the thing that frightens me the most for our community is the impact that it has on our young people. So our young people being picked off and exploited by experienced drug runners who will not only groom them into running their drugs, but at the point that they become surplus to their requirements, will drop them like a hot brick, and normally violence is involved. And when we look at crime in this area, in fact when we look at crime across the whole country and the increase in violent crime, that very often that is associated with an increase in drugs that are prevalent in that area. And in this area we've also had really incredibly, terribly sad stories. So people will remember Poppy Widdowson, and she was a little girl who lived in Grimsby with her mum, who was using drugs, was in a dreadful relationship, and the little girl was being plied with drugs by her mother, and ended up passing away. And at the time, I remember going on the local news and saying this must never happen again. Unfortunately, that has not happened again. But I don't believe that that will be the last story if we don't get a grip on what is happening in our local communities. And this is about policy development, this is about new ideas, this is about learning from experiences that people have had and feeding into a national programme that hopefully will start to turn that around. And I'm delighted that we have got some real experts in the field who can talk about their experiences. And I think when you're listening to people who have been in the police force, who have been at the front line of trying to deal with this, and they are telling us, no, what we have now is not working, then we really have to sit up and listen and look at some new strategies to tackle this. And I'm really pleased that the majority of the thrust behind the Labour campaign for drug reform is going to be looking at it from a public health perspective rather than looking at it from a law reform perspective. Because unless we start to look at it from public health and a broader public health, not just those individuals who are taking drugs, but from the impact that it has on whole communities, the long-term cost on whole communities, the strain that it puts on all of our public services, whether that's the police, whether that's A&E, whether it's our paramedics, whether it's the mental health services, whether it's the much depleted drug and alcohol services, it puts a huge strain on it. So if we can start to tackle it from the beginning in a sensible way, then hopefully it will mean that communities like ours don't feel such a strong burden. So I'm really pleased to be chairing the event tonight. I want to get as many questions in as possible, so while you're listening to the speakers, please do think of some tough and challenging questions for them. Anybody who manages to stump any of them, I'll give you 10 points for that. So thank you all so much for coming and taking time out of your evening to discuss this really important issue. And I think I'm going to be handing over now to Neil, so thank you.
I'm glad that police are very well represented in this one. I do lots of these speaking events, and usually the policing perspective is just from my own, because police are really, really good at catching drug dealers. They are brilliant at it. If you gave them 4 times the resources and said spend all of that on catching drug dealers, then the police would catch 4 times as many drug dealers. But that's part of the problem. That's actually part of the problem. I'll explain that shortly, but I'm just going to go back to the beginning first. In a drug policy perspective, who's heard of the British system? Capital B, capital S, the British system. Anybody? Yes, well that's 5 more hands than I normally get in any audience. Because it seems to be a forgotten part of our history. Now, drug prohibition that we have at the moment it's a very un-British idea. It's actually an American idea. It was born out of American domestic racism. It was a way of oppressing minorities in America. Now, then came the Second World War, and the one country on earth that came out of it richer than before was the United States, because everybody owed the United States money, which gave them enormous power. So their domestic racism, their prohibition, was then exported to the rest of the world with a very, very aggressive foreign policy. And the last resistance to that was the British system. And the British system is really simple. It followed the premise that if you have a problem with drugs, you got help, medical help. There was no moralising, and there was no judgment at all built into that system. Drug addiction was just seen as an unfortunate situation which you dealt with. There was no criminalising people. But as I say, the Americans were very aggressive with their foreign policy. Sorry, I've got to set my time ago. Bear with me. But they were very aggressive with their foreign policy. So politicians, diplomats here were pamphleting our politicians and persuading people to follow their way. And as they were doing that, the Americans measured their problematic heroin users in the hundreds of thousands. Hundreds of thousands. We measured ours in the hundreds. Now, as it's just been said, at the time when the Misuse of Drugs Act came in, there were only 1,049 heroin users in the UK. They got their prescriptions from only 2 chemists. That's how few there were. The drug was banned, all drugs were banned, it was gifted to the black market, the illicit market. Organised crime took over, and 20 years later it went up to over 300,000. We're still having the high 200,000 now. Very straightforward cause and effect. There was no incentive to find new customers before. People would just go to the doctor. The epidemiology is clear, the cause and effect. Now, when we talk about drug policy, I think we have to understand 2 things. How bad things are, and also how we got to this point. So for the book Drug Wars, my co-writer and I, we went to Liverpool and we interviewed 3 generations of Liverpool gangsters. And the older one, he used to be the right-hand man of Curtis Warren, one of the notorious gangsters. He got into organised crime in the 1970s, quickly got into the heroin trade, and became a major gangster. The second one got into it in the 1990s, at a period of time when organised crime became more international and corporate. And the third one was a 16-year-old boy who had just escaped counterland drug dealing, which he'd been doing since he was 13. Now, there's lots of questions and conversations we had to try and show change over time, but perhaps the most important question, or one of the most important, was, as a young man getting into organised crime, how easy was it for you to get hold of a gun? Now the older one said, no, I could have gone to the higher-ups, and I would have had to explain exactly why I needed a gun, and they would have listened to me patiently, and then they would have said, no, why on earth do you want to bring that kind of attention to yourself and to me by using a gun? If you've got a problem with somebody, go toe-to-toe with them, sort it out with your fists. The second one we asked, he said, well, we'd have access to automatic weapons if there was a bit of a war. We knew that, but we'd certainly never let the youngsters have them. We don't let kids have guns. And then we asked the 16-year-old, and he said, well, I'd need about 2 hours. In fact, the last time I needed a gun, he said, the last time I needed a gun, he was 15 at the time, I went to the guy and says, oh, I need a gun. And he says, oh, just shifted the last one. I've got a hand grenade there. So he said, yeah, all right. So this 15-year-old took this hand grenade home and put it in his sock drawer, ready for a rival gang that might come to his hat. It's a dispute over drug deal territory. So in 3 generations, we've gone from the control of the heroin supply, from a doctor with a prescription pad, to a 15-year-old with a hand grenade. And this is similar in cities and towns all across the UK. A very clear cause and effect. It was caused by banning the drugs in the first place. You gift the market to organised crime, and this is inevitable. Now, I used to work undercover, and I'll tell you about one event I did, one operation. In Northampton, the drug supply was being taken over by a Birmingham gang, infamous Birmingham gang called the Burger Bar Boys. Now, this gang was taking over the supply in Northampton because the local police had loads of success. They caught all the local heroin and crack dealers. So the Burger Bar Boys came in from Birmingham and took over the whole supply. Now they were dreadful. They were really awful reputation builders, and by that I mean they were raping people as punishment for drug debts, just as the way to build up their reputation and be the scariest people. So I spent 7 months in Northampton. It took me quite a few weeks to get someone to introduce me to them. In fact, I had to win them over. These 2 problematic heroin users, I had to win them over by going shoplifting with them, trading stolen goods with them, just to build my legend up. It's great fun, by the way. shoplifting. You know, if you know you're going to get away with it, it's great fun, especially if you do it in twos and you're taking turns to be lookout. Anyway, I digress. So basically, I sort of won them over, pretending to be a travelling thief, finding out where to sell the stolen baby clothes, the stolen spirits, all of this kind of thing. So I built my reputation and eventually got an introduction to these people. So I got introduced to the Burger Bar Boys. I got taken to a snooker club where they sort of held court. I got sent into this gents' toilets, and I went in, and my mate was literally shaking with fear. He'd made me learn a cover story about how long we'd known each other, which is really strange when you're trying to remember your own cover story. But anyway, suddenly this door burst open, and this guy came in, opened the cubicle door, stood on the toilet and looked over the door and said, "What's this?" And then these 400 figures burst in after him and started walking around. And every so often one would headbutt me, or one would punch me in the ribs, or push me into the other one and he'd headbutt me back. And all this was going on, he was asking me questions, and then asking my mate questions to check up on me. It seemed to go on forever. It was probably only 10 minutes or so, but it seemed to go on forever. And I became quite convinced that I wasn't getting out of there in one piece, because I know what they did. You know, they left people maimed just to build their reputation. So I was quite sure I wasn't getting out in one piece. But then he just stopped and said, "All right, what do you want?" And I went, "1 and 1, please," which is a 0.4 of heroin and a 0.4 of crack. And gave him my £40, got the phone number, and then I was into them. So I spent weeks, months even, gathering evidence of conspiracy against them all. The 6 Burger Bar Boys that were running the scene, but also, in addition to those 6 people, there were 90 other people in the town involved. And after 7 months, 96 people, there was evidence against those people. And I knew, I caught everybody. I knew, because there were no more numbers to get, no more faces to meet. I'd met everyone that I'd heard about. So I thought, great, I've got the town wrapped up here. They got help from all the surrounding counties of police, five counties worth, to do a massive impact, to do as much of it in one go as they could. Anyway, a week after it all died down, the intelligence cell person from the operation, the intelligence officer, spoke to me on the phone and he said, "Yep, we've managed to shut down the heroin and crack cocaine supply for 2 hours. 2 whole hours. That's not even enough time for someone to withdraw from heroin if they're a problematic user. It'd be 4 hours for that." You see, a rival gang in Birmingham heard about what the police did, and they're thinking, "Oh, this is fantastic. Look what the police have done for us. Put the call in, get the extra supplies ordered." 2 hours it took for the next gang to move in, for the next number. So, police are really good at catching drug dealers if you direct them that way. Now, the trouble is, county lines, it's been mentioned already. I've mentioned it already with the 15-year-old in Liverpool. It's been a problem here. Is everyone aware of county lines, the exploitation of children? That's my fault. That's my fault and all the people like me who did that work. Because when I caught the Burger Bar Boys, I caught the adults. They were hands-on with the cash, hands-on with the drugs, they were transporting it themselves, they were arranging the addresses themselves, and they got caught. But this drugs war is an arms race. When the police learn new tactics, organised crime learn new tactics. And the natural, strategic response to police success is the use of children. Because children can't be infiltrated by undercover cops the same. They can't be infiltrated by the normal police informants. They're a buffer zone between the dealer and the police. They can be easily manipulated. There's an endless supply of them. They can be bullied, threatened, blackmailed easily, and they're cheaper to pay than the adults. That would not have happened if we had not been policing drugs since 1971. It's a very clear cause and effect. There's no way any drug dealers in the 1970s would have looked into the future and thought, "Oh, one day we'll all be using children." They might not have seen that vision, but it was still inevitable. And it is inevitable that it will get worse. So, we have to ask ourselves, how bad does this have to be or have to get before we change direction. Because in that 3 generations, this is the point we've got to. So far, the government response, and I do have a good source, that's more than one source has told me this, that there is a directive to recruit child informants, to increase the amount of child informants. That's why a charity just a couple of weeks ago took the government to court about the issue, a charity called Just the Kids Law, to challenge the Home Office use of child informants. That's not the right way to go. The only way we can tackle this is by regulating the drug markets. The example of Portugal has been mentioned. It's, yes, fantastic results. Decriminalising is, of course, logical. Criminalising people who use drugs is ludicrous. It's ludicrous for the 90% of people who use drugs without problems, and it's even more ludicrous for the 10% that do have a problem with drugs. Because that's always worth saying, 90% of drug use is non-problematic. Same as alcohol. Yes, there are advantages in that, but in Portugal it's still organised crime that run the market. We can only really get a control of this problem if we take control of the markets. Different drugs have different regulatory requirements. You would never have heroin for sale in the corner shop. Heroin would only ever be dealt with in a medical way, like we used to do so successfully in Britain. So successfully. You would need different regulatory requirements for different drugs because they do different things. Cannabis, for example, you have to decide how strong it is, the makeup of it, the chemical makeup of it. You have to decide where it's going to be sold, who can buy it. But I'll tell you this, anyone with youngsters in this room, your youngsters have got much easier access to cannabis or MDMA or cocaine than they have alcohol. Significantly easier, because dealers don't ask for ID. They only want to see the colour of your money, however old you are. So whichever way you look at it, this is a pressing child protection issue. Whether it's that 15-year-old exploited and access to firearms in Liverpool, whether it's county lines kids are coming here and being extorted and blackmailed to sell drugs here, or whether it's children who just get access to drugs they shouldn't have such easy access to. It's a child protection issue, and only regulation can solve that. But there's another very pressing issue. That's another reason we need to regulate the drug market. So, is there any line of duty fans in the room? Yeah? It's good, isn't it? Well, I wasn't quite into that Morse code thing at the end there. That was a bit silly. But the corruption, I hate to worry you, but it's not exaggerated. It's not. I think Jed Mercurio has possibly read my books, particularly with the plot line of the person joining the police. Because I did an operation in Northampton where after 4.5 months, 2 of my backup team went off sick, so I was introduced to 2 new police officers. One of them, I shook his hand, no problem. The second one, I shook his hand and the hairs went up on the back of my neck. Instinctively, something about this guy was just wrong. When you've been working undercover for a few months, you tend to be feeling a little paranoid. Your senses are on fire. 12 months later, the gangster Colin Gunn was brought down. It was found that that police officer that I'd instinctively taken exception to was an employee of Colin Gunn. He'd been paid to join the police. So when I met him, he'd been in the police for 7 years. He was paid £2,000 a month on top of his police wages, plus bonuses for good information. Now, in the debriefs for that, senior police said to me, well, Woodsy, of course this happens. We know this happens. With this much money involved, how can it not happen? Now, I have to make something very clear. Only the value of the illicit drug market can pay for that kind of corruption. For 2 reasons. There is no other form of criminality that has that amount of money. Secondly, by policing drugs, we create monopolies. Sometimes gangsters even use informants to get rid of the competition. But over time, we have bigger and bigger monopolies in charge of with a big piece of the pie. Those monopolies grow, people have a larger amount of money to corrupt the system. And that's inevitable. If you want to see how far that can go, just look at Mexico, where the murder detection rate is only 1%, because it's the police that are doing the murders. It might seem far-fetched, but we are only going in one direction until we legally regulate the drug markets. So thanks for listening.
That's quite shocking. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the rest of our panel, who are just going to have 2 or 3 minutes just to make a bit of an opening statement before then we come to you as the audience, and who will be the first victim. Tim, come on.
Do you want me to?
Let's hear from Tim. Yes.
Thank you. I'll go here if that's okay. Thank you very much, Melanie, for introducing me. I'm Tim Cottingham. I'm a pharmacist from Wellington Street. I'm not here as an expert, but I'm here because I know a lot of people that do drugs, and I've got a lot of drug history, I suppose. My dad was a pharmacist before me, same pharmacy, he was there since 1959. My first exposure to drugs, if it's exposure, is when I was 10 years old. I was just old enough to go out with my dad to a break-in. Dead exciting, I'll be absolutely honest with you. And it was only 10:30. So yeah, I was a little bit late to bed that night. But I was encouraged to go with my dad. This is the day before shutters in pharmacies. Pharmacies were targeted on a regular basis for syringes, for drugs, syringes and drugs. And there was a broken window, and I was basically going to go straight in. Oh no, the police said, you can't go straight in. There's still a guy in there, and he's taken a load of drugs. Thinking, well, why would you do that? You know, going to rob the till, fine, but he'd taken a handful of something or other, and they sent the dog in, and the dog pulled him out. It was, you know, for a 10-year-old, it was dead exciting. So I'd made up my mind at that time that drugs was not where I was going. It was as simple as that. It was not something I was interested in. Unfortunately, they found me anyway, because I took over from my dad in the late 80s, and my dad was a bit of a pioneer. He was a little bit of a rogue because he did sell syringes at a time we weren't really allowed to. But he thought it was the right thing, and we had heard of AIDS and HIV, and he thought it was a good thing, and so he did. So when the first needle exchange was announced, we said, well, we may as well be a part of that. Seems like an interesting thing. I got a very negative idea about drugs because as a pharmacy student, we were warned often, if you're at a party, there's something being smoked, you are off the course. So it set me up badly, but at the same time, my dad was saying, this is probably the right thing to do. I wasn't keen on encouraging drug users to come into the pharmacy, but that's what we did. And immediately, it hit home, it started. We were doing 10 times as much as anybody else. We were seeing 20 people a day, 25 people a day. We could sort of barely keep up with it. Very soon we became the pharmacy to go to if you wanted needles. We had every size and every type. We looked after most people. Then I had a call from a friend of mine. She was a pharmacist in Manchester and said, have a chat, he's got HIV and he wants to come home to Grimsby. He wants to take methadone because he was prescribed methadone. We had never seen that before. She said, you should take him, he's a nice chap. So we did. And he was our first person on methadone. Then we saw increasing numbers of prescriptions. Unfortunately, methadone was sold on the black market. It wasn't handled very well. It's not a very good drug, I'll be honest with you. It's not a good substitute. It's cheap and cheerful. And within, I can't remember, it was the late 90s, some was sold and a child, a 14, 15-year-old girl died. I think she'd only ingested something like 50 or 60 mils, which is nothing. Problem was, she did tell somebody she'd drunk it the night before, but she didn't die till the next morning because it's so slow acting. It's a terrible thing. And so we started having to supervise people. And so lots and lots of people every day come into my pharmacy and we supervise their medication. If you've been into my pharmacy, or if you've been in other pharmacies, you will have seen it. It's healthcare, it's all we've got, that's all we've got. It's helpful, it's not perfect. We've helped a lot of people. We've had people definitely come off drugs using treatment. They never come back to tell me because they don't want to use the same haunts, and I appreciate that. And the odd times that I do see people, I'm so pleased and so proud to have been part of their journey. I can never predict the ones who are really going to get off. It's not possible. It always tends to be the ones that I think I've got no hope whatsoever are the ones that come good in the end. But even those that haven't come off drugs, that still come in to see me every day, it's a very happy place. It's not dangerous. I like looking after people. These are people I was at school with, for goodness sake, and they enjoy coming in, and we actually have a very good rapport, a good bond. It's healthcare, and it's the start, and I think it's stalled a bit in so much that we've got nothing else to offer them. Are we going to be the source of prescribed diamorphine in the future? Probably. I mean, it's going to happen, isn't it? It's just about when. It's not cheap stuff, it's in short supply at the moment. We mostly keep it, well, we do keep it for palliative care, and really there isn't quite enough. I'm always sweating when we get down to the last couple of boxes. But that's the way forward, that's what will happen. Whether it'll happen, I say, within my career lifetime, I don't know. But if it does, I'll be ready. And I think Cottingham Pharmacy, that's where people will come to first, and I'm pretty proud of that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. Thank you. And now I'm going to hear from Suzanne.
I thought we were all just going to sit down, but everyone's got up, I feel like. That was school. Yes, I'm Suzanne Sharkey. Like I was introduced, I am an ex-police officer and cooperative. I think Neil's covered the sort of the policing aspect pretty well on enforcing the drug laws. And part of my story is I'm actually in recovery from alcohol and drugs. So what that means is for 10 years, 8 months, I haven't used alcohol or other drugs. And I didn't think about my time in the police for a long, long time. I'm just sort of going to briefly what's brought me to this point here today. And I always try not to get really emotional, but I'm starting to get emotional. I ended up being locked up lots of times, and I had 2 children. I'm a mother, 2 children, a husband, a home, but I couldn't stop using. There wasn't support and help. I didn't know who to go to. And amongst that, which is one of the big things, is stigma. As a mother and a female with children, am the most stigmatised. Because I've got children and I can't stop using because of them, I must be really bad, really evil. And it used to frustrate me because people would tell me this, and then I would just turn around and go, if I could stop for my children, don't you think I would? What? I don't know what to do. So I'll fast forward that a bit. A lot of stuff happened, it was all bad. And I actually woke up in a hospital bed again after trying to kill myself again. And I had a light bulb moment that I can continue this path and I will die, or I can try an alternative route, which was going to mutual aid, seeking the support of people that are like me, women like me, that seem to be able to live a life without using alcohol or drugs. Because I just thought that was just a crazy, crazy idea. I mean, if I can't drink alcohol, what am I going to do? Where am I going to go? How am I going to meet my friends? How am I going to not, live? And it is possible. 10 years later, it is possible, and life is great. Recovery is the best thing that ever happened to me. In recovery, I then reflected on my work as a police officer. I worked in the Northumbria Police Force. I worked in the East End of Newcastle, very poor area, deprived area, high unemployment. And I was in police in the 90s when I did my undercover buying. And that is when, and what I did basically is the 90s, drug arrests were the best arrests to get. It was a time when arrest rates were used, to show your performance as a female in the police force, when there wasn't that many, actually, women in the police force. To prove myself, I wanted to arrest a lot of people. And unfortunately, it was easy to arrest people like you said, easy to arrest people with drugs. especially in the areas that I was on. There were students, I knew where they were, they'd be in possession. But the full consequences of that, I never ever thought about. Who was I was arresting, I never ever really gave any consideration to. And it makes me feel ill that I arrested people like I ended up. And so, for me, what I started looking at is, right, okay, so what is the main cause of, I know lots of people get into recovery, but lots of people don't, or they relapse, and what is it? And one of the biggest barriers for people getting into recovery and maintaining it is the criminalisation of drug use. So the policies that I want to see should be based in health, harm reduction, and human rights of people, to get basic human rights for people that are very ill and need treatment and support. And these are people that are the vulnerable people in society. Socially deprived, unemployment, poor people. They are the majority of the people that I arrested. Or young students that I arrested that now have a criminal record for drugs for the rest of their life. They cannot get rid of that. So I'm all for, like I said, the legal regulation of all drugs. And I'm so happy that Labour are taking this seriously and looking at what we can do, but it's a complex issue. I'm one of those 10% people that use very problematically. And we are complex because we have so many different aspects to it. Mental health is a huge thing with people and problematic substance use. Once I put that substance down, I was still left with my head, and that was the problem. I had my head. And what we don't have that, especially in the North East. We don't have one rehab, 24-hour rehab, we don't have one in the North East. We have day rehabs, very few. There isn't dual diagnosis, there isn't support for mental health or problematic substance use. And what we need to do is we need to look at this in the policy as well. Let those people that use drugs and can do so without causing any harm or consequences and having a really good time on it. Makes me a bit jealous that they could do that, but it's not for me anymore. Let them do that, but not have criminal sanctions because of that. So, there's other things I was going to go into, looking at it, in the meantime, what we're doing on this, we need decriminalisation of possession, we need cannabis regulation, we need the heroin-assisted treatment, we need to look at how we're going to do it with stimulants, and we need to look at who we are actually stopping, searching and arresting, because there's massive disparities within that between ethnic groups, Asian, black and white. They are far arrested, stop and search far more than white ethnic people are. And it's not because they use more drugs than this, there's no evidence to suggest that at all. So that's it in a nutshell, and I'm open to any questions on whatever part that it is. Recovery, and the point is, we are really valuable people in recovery. We are really valuable people, but unfortunately, and one of the things is, I'm sick of people dying. So I'll leave it there.
Evening everyone. Right, I was in the police for 30 years, dealt with drug dealers. I was in charge of the covert policing operations for a while. I oversaw some of the big operations that occurred in Grimsby going back some years, and the immediate effect of some of those big operations, which I didn't necessarily agree with, but it was policy that we should do with them, was exactly as you've heard described earlier. What actually happened was that there were gang wars in Grimsby trying to take over the turf that had been freed up by the arresting of, in some instances, more than 100 people over a couple of days. So I'm no fan of that, but I do differ with some of the speakers in terms of what I think the solutions might be. And am I in admiration of countries where they've grasped the nettle and reformed drugs law? Yes, I am. That doesn't necessarily mean it's immediately transferable into this country. Cultures are different, for a start, and the things as are different in every single country. So it's no good just trying to import something from somewhere else and thinking it'll work here. Let me put you all out of any misconceptions you may have around there being some solutions to this. There are no answers to the problems of drugs. It's as simple as that. It is something that will be with us forever. It's a question of how we want to manage it. We will never solve it. And in terms of how we look at reform, should we take a health approach to people that are really addicted to it? And we talk about heroin most of the time when we're talking about that. Yes, we absolutely should. Is there any point in further criminalising people who are addicts and need assistance? No. Having left the police, I also helped set up a service in North Lincolnshire around helping severely addicted people out of heroin addictions. I've seen it from the other side as well. And I also deal at a very strategic level now around trying to influence policy at a national level. What I would say is it's very easy to jump into a belief that going to do the opposite of what we currently do will lead to a much better effect on the streets. That isn't the case, actually. We need to be very careful about understanding what we're trying to achieve rather than just reacting to a problem. So, I'll give you an example. We heard earlier on about how you could regulate the drugs market. Does that mean we're going to have shops selling MCAT, heroin, cocaine, crack, crystal meth? Are we going to sell all of those legally? Is someone going to access them? At what age can you access them if we decriminalise that? And whatever line you draw on the age of that, there is a market below that age for someone to sell to people below that. So it's not as straightforward as it might seem. That isn't to say we can't do some things differently. We must do some things differently. But there are no easy answers to this. And in my view, we've got to proceed very, very carefully. We hear a lot about cannabis, for example. Let's just decriminalise cannabis. What does decriminalise mean? Does that mean that someone who's caught in possession does not get a criminal conviction? Okay. What does that do about the people supplying that then? It encourages people supplying that to push that out further with the story that you're not going to be prosecuted if you actually caught with this. So that encourages the supply. And then you say, well, let's regulate the supply of it. Okay, how do you regulate what's on the street in terms of its strength? Because if you speak to people in the mental health business, they will tell you that the effects of people smoking cannabis and using cannabis are really feeding through to their mental health problems at the moment. There is nothing in terms of taking what are currently illegal drugs that does not lead to some health issue further down the line. And when we talk about regulating the market, we tend to think in terms of heroin. We don't think about all of those social users of cocaine in nightclubs, or amphetamine in its various guises, or the new drugs which are being manufactured on an ongoing basis and which are infinitely variable. So you say you're going to regulate something, and half an hour later someone changes its makeup a little bit more, there's suddenly an illegal market there. So the reality is we will never, no matter what we do, take organised crime out of this, because however we try to manipulate the market, they will manipulate it further. So we have to look at this differently. My view is that something we don't actually think about enough is how you take away the demand for drugs. Because there's one thing that will undercut organised crime, and that is taking away people who want to use drugs. Now, that sounds simple, but that isn't simple either. I think of an analogy about changing people's perception around these things. If you go back 30 years, 35 years, people drank and drove their vehicles regularly. It was an accepted part of culture in some areas. You drank, you went to the pub, you got in your car and you drove home. And that killed people, it caused accidents. Over a period of time, that culture has been changed. It's not socially acceptable to drink and drive anymore. If people see others drinking and trying to drive, they don't think it's a bad idea to call the police and warn about that. Culture has changed around that. We can change culture, we can reduce demand. We just need to be very careful around how we think about doing that, and at the same time try to take people who are seriously addicted and have a health issue into the health arena to deal with them. So there is a multifaceted approach that needs to be taken here. There are no simple answers in this at all. We've got to think about it, and yes, the drugs laws need reform, but there is no simple, let's regulate it, all our problems will be over. That quite simply isn't the case. And I'm sorry if that disappoints a lot of people who think there is an easy answer to this, but there really isn't a simple, straightforward solution to this. Yes, I would say there is an issue around criminalisation, because I think there are people, drug dealers and some users, who should be forced into a course of conduct without necessarily criminalising them. And currently the criminal justice system means if you are a drug user who doesn't want to engage in a sort of health approach, there are no ways to push people to deal with that. So the only way you can do that is to actually give them a criminal conviction for something which they might not be able to control. So I think there is an argument for saying actually around the using of drugs, there may be a route that you can actually take someone before some kind of court or tribunal, push them into some kind of forced activity which will help them address that, but that doesn't necessarily attract a criminal conviction, which can have all sorts of detrimental impacts upon that person's life in the future, and for example access to work and some housing accommodation. If you actually reduce the likelihood of people getting into work or accommodation, you're reducing the likelihood of them actually being able to get out of taking drugs. So I do think we need to think around how we can push people into a certain course of conduct without necessarily attaching a criminal conviction to them, but that is different to trying to regulate a market and the government in effect taking over as the main supplier of drugs. I don't think the effect on the streets would be what a lot of people envisage, and what I hear in my role all of the time is the effect of OCGs, organised crime groups, drug dealers on communities. And I'm very interested in how we minimise the impact upon communities, not just look at the individuals themselves concerned in this. There needs to be a dual approach to this. I'll finish it.
We have obviously got differing views on the panel, and it's really important, I think, if we're having a discussion and we're having an honest discussion, that we do have a whole range of different views. Now, I am going to open up questions to the floor. I've got, who have I got? Paul here to help me do the facilitating. So, if you have got a question, can I ask that you put your hand up? We're going to bring a microphone round. Don't be intimidated by the microphone. Or Paul. And I'll choose the speakers. I'll do it in groups of 3, and then I'll divvy those questions up amongst the panel. And can I ask that you give your name? If you give your name clearly when you're asking the panel the question, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, my name's Mike Murphy. There's 3 of us come from some Labour Party. I'm just a bit confused as to why this has been organised by the Labour Party and what our position is and what it should be. Is there a difference between soft drugs and hard drugs with legislation and policy? I'm not sure.
That's what, did you want 3 at a time, Melanie?
Yes, please.
My name's Chris Dixon, and I've been a governor until recently for 35 years to 2 schools, primary and secondary, that serve the West Marsh in Grimsby. My question is directed to Keith, and it's about street dealing, and I know he's heard this before from our ward councillors. Dealing on the streets, I see children who I know who are watching and then become involved, carrying drugs, etc. We raise it at our forward meetings with your police officers, and quite rightly they say we need evidence. I'm looking to you, Keith, to ask the question about dealing on the streets. How soon can it be eradicated, and what can be done to stop these young people, if we're talking about child protection, getting involved in this?
I'll just come to this last one while I answer it.
Hello there. I'd just like to say, Suzanne, wow, hearing your story this evening, it's just overwhelming to hear your story, quite basically. What you said about the dual diagnosis with mental health is absolutely correct. We work on the front line and we're working with the most vulnerable people out in society. I've got to say that we've got no dual diagnosis team in Grimsby because there's no funding. So I'm asking and I'm coming to you, what can be done about this? Because people are slipping through the net.
Okay, right. I will take the first question because I think that probably makes the most sense. Can everyone hear me at the back?
Yes.
Okay, great. I don't need a microphone. So the whole point of having this event this evening is to consider whether current policy works. Things cannot stay the same, in my view, and there is a group of politicians and Labour Party members and activists who have been involved in their careers in dealing with people who are suffering from addiction problems, people who've worked in domestic violence settings and have seen the impact of drugs and drug use on families. And there is a sense that looking at what is happening in their communities, what we're doing now isn't really working. And so this is an opportunity to have a discussion to try and test some of the boundaries of what we have as received wisdom, accepted practice, and challenge some of that, because if what we have at the moment isn't working, then surely it's right for political parties to reflect upon the realities of life for people where drugs are an issue and try to make the situation better. And that's what the purpose of this discussion is. And there is an opportunity through this campaign that exists within the Labour Party to feed into future Labour policy, to try and broaden out that debate. And really, I think for too long we probably have been scared of talking about the issue. We probably haven't been very honest about the issue. And if we can start to, it might be that we don't, I hear Keith's points, that we're not going to get changes overnight. I don't think anybody should be worried that come next year we're going to be opening up MDMA shops on the high street. But I do think that views will change and policy will change, and perhaps over the course of the next 5 or 10 years we will see significant change from where we are now in order to deal with a problem that only seems to be growing. And you can only start to change views in a community if you start having the conversations openly and honestly with them. So that was the purpose of this evening. Pete, on to Chris's question.
Yeah, again, I wish there was an easy answer to that. What you are seeing is a symptom of a much larger problem. We got a little bit of history around how and why children are being used. It isn't just children that are being used. The biggest commodity for organised crime groups at the moment is people, not drugs, actually. People trafficking and using people either through Monday slavery or trafficking for drugs use or prostitution is the #1 money maker for organised crime groups around the world at the moment. So what you're seeing at a local level is a symptom of a much broader problem. It isn't just about drugs, it's about organised crime groups seeing people as a commodity again. So there is an issue there. How can it be dealt with? The impact upon your community can be dealt with in a very short term by an increased police presence, dealing with that, preventing it. What we've seen over the past decade during the period of austerity and prior to that and during that period, some, in my view, misguided leadership within policing nationally. There's a belief that crime was changing and we didn't actually need boots on the ground anymore. I think that was a way of some police chief officers trying to curry favour with the government rather than speaking up for the reality. In reality, if there is a gap, something will fill it. If the police leave the streets and visible signs of authority leave the streets, that gap will be filled by something. And all too often, especially in deprived areas of sort of general deprivation or non-wealthy areas, that is crime that fills those gaps. And if there's crime there, that will become organised. And what you're seeing is the result of an underinvestment in all of the services that can help prevent that and intervene with those kids at a very early age and stop them getting into that. We're trying a lot to prevent that happening at the moment, but we're playing catch-up because it's been 10 years of underinvestment. The Sewer Start Centre shutting down, all of that is history now. We know about that. There is a growing acknowledgement that the two contenders to be Prime Minister, well, there's one contender, they're talking about another 20,000 police officers in a very quick period of time. And I've just got Fred something today from London to say that that is a serious proposal which is being looked at. Now, if that isn't an acknowledgement that taking police officers off the streets is part of the problem we're dealing with now, I don't know what is. So that is a very short-term solution. I get a visible, authoritative presence on the streets again, make sure that we are intervening to prevent those young people being able to carry on their trade, get the support for them to be able to get out of that. And, as I said before, for me it's about taking away the demand. We've got to hit education very, very hard, but we've got to make efforts to make it an unattractive trade to get into somehow. And that's why I worry about the thoughts around the sort of decriminalisation process, because if there aren't disincentives there, people will be drawn towards it. And the organised crime groups will change to adapt to whatever that market looks like.
Thank you. The next question we had was about dual diagnosis. It's been pointed out, just an explanation about dual diagnosis in case there's anybody that doesn't know, which is where people have got mental health issues as well as having an addiction issue. And very often if you presented services with an addiction issue, you will get treatment for your addiction issue, but you won't get treatment for your mental health issue until you've sorted out your drug addiction issue. Or if you get, or you might get your mental, in fact you won't get mental health support if you are taking drugs, you just won't get it.
The chicken or the egg?
Yeah, exactly. So it's been described as a chicken and egg situation, and until you can get that, was that a scrambled egg? Until you can marry those two up, because very often people who are using drugs will be self-medicating to help with mental health issues. And I wonder if Suzanne has anything to add to the point that was made.
Yeah, I mean, it's always, we look at the NHS and policing or being in what part of my argument is there is money, but it's being misspent. A lot of money is being spent on law enforcement. And so I'd like just to explain, so for example, look at the Portugal model where they decriminalised personal use. And what the government did is they ring-fenced 60% of the money to go into education, health and treatment. And what's actually happened from that is that you have money to offer the treatment and services, you educate in schools. It's actually one of the things is drug use amongst it's 13 to 16-year-olds looking at has actually dropped, which is what we all want to see, is less youth using drugs. And so that's the problem, it's money, and we need people being able to diagnose dual diagnosis. People can do that, but then you need that wraparound support, which is again where we need the money. So where we get the money from, it is complex, but there are solutions, and the solutions all around the world. Okay, we are the UK, we're not like Portugal, we're not like Colorado, we're not like Canada, but there is hard and fast evidence to show that using decriminalisation, regulation, legalisation so far of cannabis has huge benefits to society and communities. And the problem with the communities that we have today is we're broken. There's no sense of community. The schools don't get support. Where are the youth clubs? Where are the facilities?
There's no self-efficacy.
There's nothing. And for me, what I was, my self-esteem, what I thought of myself is so low, and I see these kids coming through, there's no hope for them. And the problem is enforcing the laws as we do for drugs does not work. 50 years, you know, it's not like, oh, we've tried it for 5 years, let's see what we want. So we need to change, and one solution, because there are solutions, and they work. And one of them is not arresting more people. Drug use, you will never reduce demand for drugs. Throughout history, we've always used drugs. Because you know what? They can be good. You can have really good experiences with them. And people use them, and they criminalise, and they hide from it, or if you like the 10%, we stigmatise, and with the lowest of low. We need to decriminalise it. I don't like it, you know, but drug use is normal. You know, and the Home Office have said they don't want to normalise it, they don't want reduction. Drug use is normal. Look at pubs in Grimsby. They're all drug users. You know, let's do something different. And they are, they're drug consumption rooms. Thank you.
Misunderstood Suzanne's point there. I didn't think that everybody who was having a drink was also then taking some other kind of drugs. But yes, there is a point. There is a point about the fact that we consider it to be socially acceptable to take a drug like alcohol or a drug like nicotine through cigarettes, although there is now a public health pressure to reduce that usage, obviously, but it does have a health impact, and we still consider that to be acceptable, and we continue to encourage people to do that. We continue to allow it to be advertised. We continue to accept that that is part of our social norms, which is not something that we do when it comes to other substances. Okay, can I get a show of hands for more questions? I'm not picking everything now.
Thanks. James Sear. I've worked with young people for quite a long time now, from both a police perspective and from a local authority perspective, who have been involved with county lines. And I just want to touch on something that Neil brought up earlier about the fact that there's been recent legislation, there's been recent court cases that are making it easier and easier for the police to use those young people as human intelligence sources. Should not the Labour Party, as the party of social justice, at a very bare minimum in their drugs policy, be looking to reduce the weaponisation of children? Because that's what it is. These children do not understand the consequences of giving information to the police. They don't understand consequences very well, full stop, which is why they're involved in county lines in the first place. So why we think that using those children as weapons against the dealers is not going to have a massive negative impact on those children for the rest of their life. And I'd be very interested to know what, particularly what the Police and Crime Commissioner's view is on that.
Thank you. Yeah. 2 more? Anyone from this side? Something lazy.
I'm Vicky. My thing is kind of following on from what Suzanne was saying and the alcohol thing, and bringing one of Keith's points, which I didn't really agree with, where he was saying that, you know, if we regulate how strong things are, that then we're still going to have the illegal, but we don't have illegal stronger alcohol, yeah. And I think that's a straw man. That's my feeling on that.
One more? I'm not going to let that. No. Sorry. Sorry.
Just a quick follow-up point from that. Sorry. Well, during Prohibition, I think it's quite well known that there was illegal alcohol, such as moonshine, absolutely. And I think a direct result, perhaps, of cannabis prohibition also has been the increase in NPS. And obviously, part of the government response was to introduce the new Psychoactive Substances Act, which I'm not sure has been particularly successful. So, you know, ultimately, I mean, I'm a person in long-term recovery. I also work in substance misuse. God, I'm really nervous, sorry. Never nervous. But during my kind of dark days of substance misuse, legal issues never really bothered me. I wasn't too bothered whether it's a Class A substance or a Class C substance, with respect.
I use because of social, environmental factors in my life and stuff that I'm happy with. So I think the whole punitive approach to substance misuse, I think, hasn't had any evidence success. And as Neil rightly says, you know, it's actually gone the opposite way with more people using substances. So I think we need a dramatic new approach to it, really.
Thank you. I know saying don't be nervous immediately makes people more nervous. I shouldn't have said that, sorry. Okay, so keep, like, just to make, we've got about half an hour, so hopefully we will get everybody in for questions. Can I get the panel just to try and be a bit snappy with their responses? And then we've got more questions that we can answer. I'm trying to be as polite as possible. Don't ramble, everybody. So, keep on party policy and young people as intelligence, please.
Well, I have overseen the use of children as human intelligence sources. It's a very strictly controlled area, rightly so. I wouldn't support that as an area of growth, I've got to say. There are occasions when it is appropriate, but they're very few and far between. Quite often, a young person might be the only route into somewhere to prevent someone losing their life. Is it appropriate then? There's always a balance of proportionality and reasonableness, and I think some judicial oversight of the use of young persons might be something that the party could think about a little bit more, rather than just saying yes or no. Unfortunately, in law enforcement, it's not as straightforward as yes or no a lot of the time, really.
Thank you. Neil.
Well, I mean, the use of children as informants, we have to make this clear, this is a drug policy issue. You know, the Home Office say that it might sometimes be a necessity in terrorism offences, all this and that. We're talking about informants. At least 90% of adult informants are for drugs. That's just the way it is. It's become a drug policy tool. Now, to use children for that, I think should never, ever be allowed. And the reason for that, one of the reasons for that, is if police catch a burglar, say in a town like Grimsby, you catch a burglar, you're likely to have burglaries go down. Because there's a limited number of people who are going to commit that crime, and a limited number of opportunities for that crime. If you catch a drug dealer, as I said earlier on, it just makes an opportunity for two more. Now, if you're using children to keep that perpetual wheel turning, where's the benefit in that? Where's the benefit of putting that child at risk and potentially keeping them in a situation where they'd be better escaping from? For what? For what benefit? So I think it should never be allowed at all. But importantly, if you could make a statement that it was never allowed, then every single county lines kid will be that little bit safer, because as soon as a police source handler speaks to a 16-year-old and says, right, we want you to provide information for this, many of them will give that whole script of that conversation to their boss, to the person in the mid-20s who runs them. And they're going to know that the police are seeking out child informants. And what will be the response? What is the response? To prevent even adult informants? It's terrible. The scariest gangsters are the ones who survive, because they don't get grassed up. And the same logic will be, and is being applied to children. We do know there is a drive to recruit more children to county lines, because sources within the police have told us this. So it's happening.
Thank you. Tim, have you got any thoughts on the socio-economic element that drives people to drug use?
Very expensive hobby. I mean, the people that can most afford to do drugs, I wouldn't say don't. Problem is, it seems to me, just from, it's only in my experience, the people that can least afford it are the ones that are doing it and spending huge amounts of money doing that. The amount of crime associated with getting that money is far greater than, because when something's stolen, it's not sold at face value, it's very much diminished. Giving people more money, I'm not super comfortable with that. You know, when you get very cold weather and people get cold weather payments, That's when they actually monitoring the weather and saying, I think tomorrow the cold weather payments might kick in, and then they've got some more money to spend. Whether crime goes down, I don't know, but I do know giving people more money is a tricky one to address poverty. It's just a concern of mine. And the other thing is, people on benefits only ever have a fixed amount of money each week, don't they? Of course, they say they never have more than £100. They have £100 at the start of the week and nothing at the end of the week. So they can only ever afford £100. Anything extra it has to be got through criminal activity. But how you deal with that, I don't know.
Do you mind if I just clarify something there?
Please do.
Because we have to be very careful that we are talking about two different things. If we're talking about problematic drug use,
yeah.
There's only 10% of people who use drugs have a problem with them, and that 10% is a sliding scale. There are varying differences of how problematic that can be. And so, the most, for example, heroin, 10% of heroin users consume 50% of the whole market. So that shows you that there are some people who need a lot more help than others. And most people who use drugs don't commit crimes because 90% just use them occasionally, or it's just part of their choice.
3 more?
Yes.
Yeah. I'll come over there in a sec. So
Hi, I'm John Tatum, and yes, I am a relation. It's a comment as much as a question. It seems to be one of the dangers is when we talk about legalising drugs, that people then jump to the conclusion this is about a free-for-all. In fact, that's exactly the term that the guy that Neil and Johnny were on the phoning programme this morning. That was his interpretation. It's a free-for-all. Or it's about, well, you're approving drugs, but drugs are dangerous. The message we really need to keep hammering home, I think, is the one Suzanne said. People are going to use drugs. This isn't about stopping people using drugs. People are going to use drugs. We've seen that whatever the criminal cost is, people continue to use drugs. Drugs have some upsides, that's why people use them, but almost all drugs have downsides, and there it is with alcohol, tobacco and so on. Is the best way of dealing with those downsides to leave drug supply in the hands of criminals? That really is a free-for-all, it seems to me. Or is it by regulating it and managing and getting across health messaging in that way? Which is actually what the Canadians are doing around cannabis. Yes, they legalise cannabis, but they're doing this as part of a campaign to warn people about some of the dangers of over cannabis use. So, it's important to get across the message that legalisation is not a free-for-all. It's not saying, yeah, let's all go and have a great time. It's great to use drugs, kids, go and do it. It's a way of getting that regulation into a sensible form rather than leaving it in the hands of criminals.
There you go, buddy.
Duncan Anderson. I'm looking at this from the mental health point of view. I know that there's some research to say that some people who take drugs, and I'm thinking more of cannabis than anything else, that there's been a claim that they get some mental health problems from it. There's another claim that people with mental health problems are drawn towards cannabis, and therefore they find some benefit. From my personal experience, I found it was helpful for dealing with anxiety and depression. I'm not talking about the modern skunk and things like that. I'm talking, going back to things like Rocky, Red Leg, those, go back to the 80s and 90s times. It did help relieve those situations. Now, when I was getting my diagnosis, I was talking to the people because it's just been announced that the government were going to ask teachers to identify school children with mental health problems, in particular dyslexia and autism. And I was saying what would have happened to them before. They'd been just as troublemakers. Now the police have to deal with a lot of troublemakers. You often find about on the roads and things, rooftop protests and various things like that. I'm not talking about high-level crime. The sort of low-level crime that takes up a lot of police resources, is a huge inconvenience to people, in the daily lives. And you often hear, why don't you just get a fire brigade to put fire hose on them and everything? that's not really going to solve anything. It might make the local residents happy, but it's not going to solve anything. How much of that can be attributed to drug use, or is it that people using low-level drugs, softer drugs, to control it? Would it be sensible to have maybe for medical purposes? We already have cannabis available for pain control, for physical problems. What about mental problems? The problem you're going to get with just blanket legalisation of cannabis. What about, for example, what about a lorry driver who takes them at a party, smokes some cannabis at that party? He's going around and he just wants to join in. Monday morning he's going to work. He's still in his bloodstream. He's driving a 40-ton lorry. And other professional drivers. The refineries and all the other petrochemical places on the docks, there was zero tolerance to drink and drugs. You've got a problem there if you're going to start legalising it across the board. But there might be a good argument to say, is there a way, because we've always do it with sort of physical pain, what about mental pain, such as anxiety, such as depression, and those sorts of things?
Cool, thank you. One more, anyone for a break? No, this lot, you got that this. Oh, that was a late one, sorry. I'll come over to you guys next. Take a minute.
Martin Childers, we're here at the invitation of the Labour campaign for drug policy reform. Surely this is a cross-party issue. Changing the law it has to go through Parliament. Ought not to be a parliamentary cross-party group for reform rather than the Labour campaign. Can any efforts be made to bring that about?
Martin, on that last point about it being a cross-party issue, it is, yes. And there are a few people from other parties who are prepared to talk about it. There is an all-party parliamentary group that operates to discuss these things, but there is absolutely no point, I don't think, in even all of the parties agreeing without having community buy-in about the direction that these things are going.
I agree with that.
Absolutely.
My question was,
agree that they're. I mean, today, maybe, I don't know. What can I say? I'm a Labour Party representative, and it's something that I thought that our community, would benefit having the conversation about. It's not something that I've had Conservative colleagues battering my door down saying I really want to be on the panel to discuss this. And that is, and that's a challenge because it's part of that honesty in the conversation and being prepared to discuss the realities of the situation that we face in our communities. So there are things happening on a cross-party basis. Would I like it to be more localised across the whole of the country and everybody being part of this? Yes, I would. And I will endeavour to encourage more to do so. So, who wants to answer John's point?
Would you like me to?
Yeah.
I think it's a very good point about how cannabis has changed.
Oh, this is Duncan.
Oh, sorry. So that one.
You go to Duncan. Go on,
all right. Sorry. I think it's a very good point about how cannabis has changed. There's something called the iron law of prohibition, that any drug gets more dangerous and stronger over time because it's prohibited, because it's more cost effective for the illicit market to produce stronger products. It's like in alcohol prohibition in America, within a few weeks you couldn't buy beer anymore, you couldn't buy strong spirits and moonshine. It's the same thing, which is why we have the mental health problems with cannabis have, from a very good report from Voltfast, that showed that the increase in levels of THC in cannabis has completely mirrored the increased reported problems with mental health with the drug. And there is clear medical evidence that it is the street strains, the highest THC strength, which is causing the problem. So the answer is a regulated product. But as for the driving laws, it doesn't matter whether the drug is illegal or not. We should always be making sure that we prevent people using and driving, and that doesn't make any difference for regulating drugs for adult use at all. The issue remains the same either way.
Suzanne, I'm just come back on John's point, which was the concern about legalisation equating to being a free-for-all.
I mean, well, yeah, I mean, like I said, that is what people, when you say legalise regulation of all drugs, that what does that mean? You're going to buy heroin in shops? Of course it doesn't, because each drug has its solutions to, like Neil said, heroin will not be able to be bought over the counter. It will be under a medical model where you are prescribed it, like in the old days that you used to cannabis. Yes, you see those whether you go in shops where you would be able to go and choose. And there's for example, what we've done in Massachusetts is where it's a social equity program of what they have in the shops is they have all the different grades of cannabis that's available. They also have advisors and people that are experts. So if you're going in with an issue with pain, they can then prescribe the right cannabis for you. A bit like going to the doctor and getting the right medicine for you. The problem with the illegal market is that is what's caused, like Neil's just said, what we see of children that have psychosis who smoke too much cannabis. Just to off the point slightly is, if you have a child that's smoking too much cannabis, why is that child smoking too much cannabis? And you have to treat the pain. We have to talk, we haven't talked enough about trauma. People in 10% like myself, we're medicating on pain. And the business, the solution to that is but again, like I say, with the legal regulated market, it would mean there would be access for the people that need it and support that's needed. So I've sort of gone around a bit there about the question to get back to what I think hasn't been mentioned and is really important, especially childhood trauma. There's a huge correlation between childhood trauma, whether that's violence, neglect, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, that and ties with growing up and having problematic substance use is huge. You're more likely to get that from childhood trauma than you would get diabetes from too much sugar. It's the links that I've had as childhood experience, the lady that's teaching, we are creating the next generation of traumatized people that will then end up using drugs problematically.
I think that's a really good point. We haven't delved too much into the mental health aspect or the education of children aspect. I don't know if there will be some more questions on things like that, but back to you.
Cool. Anyone, if you do have questions on that, just put your hand up. Put your hand down if you got a question around educating people.
My question to all of them actually is, what is the message to children if we do decriminalise drugs or change the laws around drugs? How would you do that in schools and around? I appreciate with alcohol, we still tell children to be careful with alcohol, but how would we change that with regards to drugs if we were to legalise or decriminalise drugs?
Do you have any questions on drug consumption rooms? That's another thing we've not talked about. No? Any questions on drug consumption rooms? Any questions from people that work in drug treatment? Not talking about drug treatment cuts? Oh, yeah. And then I'll come, then there was someone over there.
Right, okay, I think my question is really actually for all of them, but particularly for Neil and Suzanne. Suzanne, yes, I was extremely moved by what you said. I'm not working currently, but I used to work for 10 years in drug and alcohol misuse. I'm very strong about it being medically, being actually treated as a health issue. And not just because of actually the effects on the drug user, but as a health visitor, actually having sort of seen the effects on children, actually let's treat the family as well as the drug user, right? And if you actually take away the legality, you reduce the stigma, you actually improve the visibility, and you actually start to get in with more of a harm reduction approach than we are currently doing so. Because the children I used to work with when I set up a group felt so stigmatised because of what was happening to their parents, and anything that could reduce that surely could only be good.
Thank you very much. Hi panel, I hope this happens again because I think this is the way to go, yeah? If you bring it to the public, I don't think there's that many public here is in like families connected with as such. I think if there was invited That's my hope. And you mean you were planning to go there, it was hard for me to get a ticket to get here. I had to go through the thing which I was told not. But also the main point is that my family's been affected by drugs. I was affected by drugs when I was younger. I've gone through the whole lot, well, more or less. The families, there's a place called Harrison House in Grimsby that is supposed to help people with psychological problems and that. My son's been to prison because of losing his temper time and time again. He takes cannabis quite often that. Other kind of things have affected the family, like cocaine and that, and I think that's the two little and big kind of things in this town. There is other drugs and that and everything, but it just seems that, like you said, you convict the person who's holding and stuff or whatever, but you don't take care of the family. And it is like 10 other people or whatever. I mean, I think Tim's a good one, I think you all are, really. I think the police commissioner is probably stuck in his ways because he is trying to place back down. And that's no disrespect. You know what I mean? I appreciate it, but like I asked him, around that way, nobody comes to ask you what's happening. Yeah? They don't. There's houses boarded up, there's windows put through, there's cars attacked, everything. And because it's called a problem area where I live, which is often called in that way, even you've got councillors like Chris Dixon saying about the kids and that, my heart goes out to them all, but what can you do? Do you know what I mean? You can't stop them taking it and experimenting, but I think a lot of people experiment and then stop it because they realise the difference between it. Thank you very much. Sorry about the time. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So Suzanne first. What's the message? Right, so I was doing education. Yeah, so again, examples from where they have decriminalised drugs, a lot of money was put into education. And that was, I'm not saying, all children should have drugs. Drugs aren't safe, okay? And that's why we need regulation, but that's why we also need to educate our children. And what I would like to see is definitely put into drug education in schools, where they can see and be educated on the harms that drugs do. Also, that if you're going to do this, this is how you do it safely. We don't want you to do it, but if you do, this is what you do. And things like where we have festivals are very popular now, a lot more popular, and within that, children are going in, there are drugs there, believe it or not, there's drugs there. What to do in those situations where we have the loop that will test what drugs that they brought in, tell them that it's safe, you use this amount, the harm reduction aspect. But let's not underestimate our children. Like the gentleman said there. Most people experiment, have a little go. I think we all like to be sick we don't do that again. Most people. But also, when we have responsibilities and families, most of us, they go, that's not for me anymore. I did it, whatever, and they move on. What we need to do is educate our children on all of those aspects, and some will decide not to, some will decide to, and if they are going to do them, then what's the safest way that they can do that? It's underestimating to make good choices, We've all made mistakes. I'm sure all of us adults make mistakes. We've got children like, they're never going down the town. They will be drinking underage. They will be doing all this stuff. It's to include smoking and alcohol as well. Again, unfortunately, that comes down to money and funding. I think all schools should have access to counsellors and mental health, which is what actually they did in Colorado with the money they made from the legalisation of cannabis. They put money in too, so that all schools, I don't know all schools, but all schools should have a counsellor and a nurse for someone to go to. Again, that is one way that you can get money, by legalisation of cannabis, but also again by taking the money saved could be put into educating children, and we need that, we definitely need that. Thank you. I had a thought while we're discussing this, and then, I am a policy maker in Parliament, and one of the fear factors around this conversation is situations like Leah Betts, and I don't know whether people can remember, it probably was the late 90s or early 2000s when a young middle-class white girl went out with her friends and took ecstasy and died. And it was, there were incredibly shocking images all over the front pages of the newspapers. It made all of the news, and it reinforced the way in which we choose to deal with drugs. And just as a point of consideration, there will always be a worry that going down a route of greater permissiveness, that there is some form of backlash in the event that you create permissiveness or greater permissiveness, and then there is a tragedy that happens again. And where then the blame lies, and whether there is then a social backlash, a civic backlash, or whether the backlash is already happening because we are failing to do anything now. It was just a point that crossed my mind that I thought I'd throw out there. Neil, do you want to come back on whole family treatment?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can only really pay for that, I think, if you make the shift away from law enforcement into health, and you've got to look at that holistic view. And I think Suzanne made the most important point. You've got to look at the causes where people have drug problems, you know, and it is about childhood trauma. So when we arrest people or step over people on the pavement who are really having a hard time with drugs, we are looking down on people who are trying to cope with their childhood memories. That's the reality of problematic drug use. And so the idea of criminalising them just becomes horrendous. But can I just respond to your point about MDMA, and especially the point earlier on we said, well, don't think we're going to be making legalising MDMA. Actually, we should do as a priority, absolutely. Because MDMA is not prohibited because it's dangerous. It's dangerous because it's prohibited. 74 young people died from MDMA last year, and every single one of those deaths was because of the lack of regulation. People are dying for the lack of regulation. Now, I don't think you're going to increase permissiveness, because anyone who's danced in a field at a festival amongst people using MDMA, the permissiveness is already there. It's part of our culture. Electronic dance music is here to stay. People who use MDMA, that's why they do it. Let's make it safer, and you can do that by regulating.